Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of short days, endless nights, and a cold that crept into your bones and never let go. We're diving into what it really meant to face a medieval winter. Forget the warm sweaters, electric heaters, or stocked supermarkets that we take for granted today. The truth is simple: if you were dropped into a winter in the year 1325, you probably wouldn't make it through the first few weeks. So, before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights, maybe pull a blanket over yourself, and get comfortable. If you're listening in bed, close your eyes and let your imagination do the work. You've just woken up in late November, somewhere in Europe, and the first snowflakes are starting to fall. The transition into winter back then was brutal. Autumn wasn't a season of pumpkin spice and cozy afternoons. It was a desperate rush to harvest whatever the land had given you that year. Families worked from sunrise to sunset pulling turnips, storing cabbages, cutting grain, salting meat, and stacking firewood. Because if you didn't have enough by the time the first frosts came, you and your family would starve. There were no second chances, no grocery store down the street, no safety net. You either prepared well enough, or you prayed. And even the most careful preparation often wasn't enough. By December, the landscape turned grey and lifeless. The sun disappeared earlier and earlier until darkness stretched for more than half the day. Imagine 16 hours of night, with only dim candles or a smoky fire to light your way. No streetlights, no glow from nearby houses, just an all-encompassing blackness outside your door. Inside your home, a one-room wooden hut or a small stone cottage, the air was thick with the smell of smoke because windows were covered with cloth or wood to keep out the drafts. Ventilation was poor, so every time someone threw a log on the fire, the smoke curled and clung to the ceiling beams, irritating lungs and eyes. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The clothing of the time was heavy wool and linen, laid again and again, but even that could only do so much. Wool absorbed moisture easily, and once it was wet from snow or mist, it clung to your body like ice. Boots were often just leather shoes with scraps of wool inside. Socks didn't exist the way we know them now. People wrapped their feet in cloth, which quickly wore through or froze solid if it got wet. Imagine stepping outside to fetch water and coming back with frozen, stinging feet that never truly warmed up again. Fireplaces were the heart of winter survival, but they were inefficient. The heat rose straight up the chimney, leaving the rest of the room cold. Families often huddled close together, sometimes even bringing in livestock at night. Cows, goats, or chickens might share the same room as the family, not because people liked the company but because the body heat of animals added precious warmth. This also meant the room smelled of manure, hay, smoke, and unwashed bodies. There were no showers, no clean laundry, no fresh scents. The human experience of winter was as raw and earthy as it gets. Food was another constant worry. The harvest might have looked decent in October, but by December you were already rationing. Bread hardened within days, and pottage, the standard peasant meal of boiled grains and vegetables, became thinner and thinner as supplies dwindled. Salted meat might be stored in barrels, but even that spoiled if salt was scarce. Root vegetables shriveled in the cellar, and mold crept into whatever wasn't sealed properly. Rats found their way into granaries, stealing grain that could mean the difference between life and death. For a modern person used to grocery runs and take-out meals, the monotony and scarcity of medieval winter diets would be unbearable. But it wasn't just food and warmth. Winter also brought disease. Crowded together in damp, smoky rooms, families became breeding grounds for illness. Coughs turned into pneumonia quickly, and without medicine, even a small infection could be fatal. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant people weakened from vitamin deficiencies like scurvy, though in Europe it often went unrecognized. In some years, epidemics swept through villages during the cold months, taking the youngest and the oldest first. And remember, this was centuries before antibiotics or hospitals as we know them. Getting sick in December might mean you didn't live to see March. The psychological weight of winter was crushing. Imagine endless nights, your stomach growling, your body aching from cold, and nothing to look forward to except survival. Entertainment was limited to storytelling by the fire, singing, or perhaps simple games with bones or stones. Books were rare and expensive, reserved for monasteries or the wealthy. For ordinary peasants, distraction was minimal. Each day was about getting through the next one. The idea of a seasonal depression existed, even if it didn't have a name. The long darkness and isolation wore on the human spirit. Travel was nearly impossible. Roads froze, rivers iced over, and snow buried paths. Horses struggled, carts broke, and people who tried to journey risked frostbite, getting lost, or being attacked. Wolves roamed in some regions, hungry and desperate themselves, while bandits knew travelers were vulnerable. For most people, leaving your village after November was unthinkable. Isolation set in quickly, and entire communities could go weeks without outside contact. If a neighbor's family fell ill, there was little you could do beyond offering prayers, because you couldn't risk spreading sickness to your own household. And all of this hardship hit hardest right at the start, when the shock of winter first set in. In October, you still had a few fresh apples left, a bit of sunlight, a sense of relief from the harvest. By December, the walls felt like they were closing in, and you realized that the worst was still to come. January and February were the true killers, when supplies ran low and temperatures dropped to their coldest. The arrival of winter was just the beginning, but it was enough to remind you that survival was not guaranteed. So if you woke up in a medieval winter today, you'd feel the shock immediately. The lack of heating would leave you shivering within minutes. The smoky air would sting your lungs. The scratchy wool clothing would itch and fail to keep you warm. Your stomach would grumble, your body would ache, and your mind would slowly sink under the weight of darkness and silence. This wasn't the romantic winter wonderland of modern holiday movies. It was survival against a merciless season, and most of us, accustomed to warmth, comfort, and abundance, wouldn't even last a week. And that's just the first taste. Because as harsh as December was, the medieval winter still had months to go, each more brutal than the last. When you picture a medieval house, you might imagine something quaint and rustic, the stone cottage with smoke curling from the chimney, or a timber-framed building with a thatched roof, snow resting gently on top. From the outside, it might look almost cozy. But step inside, and you'd quickly realize that these homes were not built for comfort, and they were certainly not built for the brutal test of winter. In fact, one of the main reasons you wouldn't survive a medieval winter is because the very place you were supposed to shelter in wasn't much of a shelter at all. Most medieval homes, especially for peasants, were designed for summer and autumn, not for the freezing winds of January. The walls were often made of wattle and daub, a lattice of wooden sticks plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. When fresh, it could hold together surprisingly well, but over time cracks appeared, and those cracks leaked cold air. Stone houses might have been sturdier, but stones don't hold heat. They absorbed the chill of the outside world and radiated it back inside, making the room feel like a cellar. Wooden cottages had gaps between planks, which rattled and whistled whenever the winter wind blew. Windows weren't the glass-paned, insulated rectangles we know today. Glass was a luxury, available only in monasteries or for the wealthiest nobles. For ordinary families, windows were nothing more than open holes, sometimes covered with wooden shutters or stretched animal hide that let in light but did little to keep out cold. Oiled cloth was another option, a piece of linen soaked in animal fat, which created a translucent surface. It let in a pale glow during the day, but it flapped and warped in the wind. And when snowstorms rolled through, the wind howled against the shutters, rattling the entire frame. Sleeping in a house like that wasn't much different from sleeping in a shed with a blanket nailed over the door. The roof was usually thatch, bundles of straw laid thick enough to shed rain and snow. But thatch wasn't perfect. It leaked in heavy weather, especially as it aged. Water dripped through, turning the floor into mud or soaking your bedding. Worse, rodents and insects loved to nest in the roof, and in winter, when food was scarce, they found their way down into the living space. You might wake in the night to the sound of scurrying above you, or worse, to find a rat nibbling at your stored grain or crawling over your bed. If you had a loft above the main room, maybe for children or extra storage, the thatch directly overhead didn't keep out drafts, it just made it harder to see the stars through the cracks. Inside, there was no insulation. The idea of padding the walls, sealing the windows, or layering the roof didn't exist. Heat from the fireplace escaped as quickly as it was made. A hearth might be at the center of the room, but without a proper chimney, the smoke filled the air until it found its way out through holes in the roof or a small opening in the wall. In wealthier homes, chimneys existed, but they were primitive and sucked heat upward. In either case, the fireplace provided a circle of warmth only a few feet wide. Beyond that, the room was freezing. Families often pushed their beds close to the hearth, but that came with risk. Stray sparks could ignite straw bedding, and fire was one of the leading dangers of medieval homes. Floors were usually dirt, sometimes scattered with straw or rushes. In summer, this was tolerable. In winter, it became a frozen mess. Mud tracked in from boots, melting snow dripping from clothing, animal droppings from livestock kept indoors, all of it mixed together on the ground. Families changed the rushes occasionally, but they quickly became damp, moldy, and foul-smelling. Imagine trying to stay warm while lying on a mattress stuffed with straw, on top of a floor of frozen dirt and filth. Even the wealthiest peasants couldn't avoid this reality. And then there was the draft. People in the Middle Ages often complained about it, even though it was part of life. Wind forced its way in through every crack, whistling under doors, pushing through window coverings, seeping through gaps in the roof. Curtains, when available, were used not just for privacy but as a desperate attempt to block the constant chill. Beds sometimes had canopies or heavy drapes for this reason, to trap a small bubble of warmer air around the sleepers. But most people didn't have that luxury. They just pulled their wool blankets tighter and shivered through the night. Firewood was another problem. Houses weren't designed with chimneys and hearths large enough to burn all night long. Most families didn't even have enough firewood to burn continuously. Collecting wood was hard work, and forests were often controlled by lords who charged fees for access. Peasants gathered what they could, fallen branches, brushwood, and sometimes dried dung. A fire might last a few hours in the evening, but by midnight it dwindled to embers. Families woke up shivering in the early hours, teeth chattering, breath misting in the air, until someone stirred the coals and coaxed another flame from scraps of kindling. It was a nightly battle just to keep a spark alive. We also have to talk about the smell. With livestock inside for warmth, with damp clothing hung near the fire, with straw bedding never truly dry, medieval homes in winter were overwhelming to the senses. Smoke stung the eyes, manure mixed with mud underfoot, sweat soaked into wool clothing that was rarely washed. Without fresh air or ventilation, odors lingered and intensified. To a modern person, used to clean laundry and fresh sheets, the environment would feel suffocating. And yet this was normal life. People didn't expect comfort, they expected survival. In wealthier towns, larger houses had stone walls, wooden floors, and even glazed windows in rare cases. But don't be fooled, these were still cold and drafty by today's standards. A noble's hall might be impressive in size, with tapestries on the walls and servants rushing about, but it was also enormous, echoing, and nearly impossible to heat. Fires roared in central hearths, but the warmth rarely reached the far corners. Guests wrapped themselves in cloaks and fur even indoors, sipping hot drinks to keep their hands from stiffening. Luxury meant you were less likely to starve, not that you were comfortable. The truth is, houses in the medieval world weren't sanctuaries from the cold, they were partial shields, barely enough to take the edge off winter's bite. For people living in them, that was normal. They were used to the drafts, the smoke, the damp. But if you, with your 21st century expectations of comfort, stepped into one on a cold December night, the shock would be immediate. Your body would tense from the chill. Your lungs would burn from the smoke. Your feet would ache on the frozen floor. and the thought of living months in such conditions would seem unbearable. This is why people dreaded winter so deeply. Not only was food scarce and illness common, but their very homes betrayed them. They didn't step inside to escape the cold, they stepped inside to lessen it slightly, to delay the frostbite. Survival wasn't about being warm, it was about being just warm enough not to die. And when you think about it like that, the medieval house becomes less of a home and more of a fragile shell, a thin layer of wood, clay, and straw between you and the freezing world outside. So as the snow piled up against the walls and the wind howled through the cracks, you would quickly realize that your shelter wasn't the safe refuge you thought it was. It was just another battlefield, and the enemy was the cold itself. If you think the cold and the drafty houses were bad, let's talk about the single biggest fear that haunted every medieval winter: running out of food. You could wrap yourself in every layer of wool you owned, you could keep your fire going with dung and twigs, but none of that mattered if your stomach was empty. And in the Middle Ages, it wasn't a matter of if hunger would come, it was when. Winter was known as the hungry season for a reason, and food storage, or the lack of it, was one of the main reasons survival was so difficult. The entire rhythm of the year revolved around the harvest. Peasants and farmers lived in a cycle of planting, tending, and then desperately reaping every last stalk of grain before the frost arrived. The autumn harvest wasn't about celebration, it was about survival. Every ear of wheat, every root pulled from the ground, every cabbage hauled into storage was insurance against the long dark months ahead. Because once the frost came, there were no fresh vegetables, no growing fields, and no second chances. The earth froze, and it wasn't giving you anything until spring. But storing food was an art, and it was far from perfect. Imagine trying to keep enough food fresh to feed your entire family for 4 or 5 months without refrigerators, freezers, or vacuum-sealed packaging. Meat had to be salted or smoked. Salt itself was expensive, so only those with better means could afford to preserve large amounts of pork or beef. Fish could be dried, but if you lived inland, fish wasn't easy to come by. Grain was stored in sacks or wooden bins, but rats, mice, and insects always found their way in. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were piled in cellars or buried in cool pits, but dampness and mold spread quickly. A single spoiled batch could wipe out weeks of food. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, but winter bread was nothing like what you picture today. Fresh, fluffy loaves didn't exist. By January, bread was hard, sour, and often filled with filler grains, rye, barley, or even ground-up peas and beans. In famine years, bakers were known to stretch flour by adding sawdust, ground-up tree bark, or straw. Eating bread like that wasn't just unpleasant, it sometimes made people sick. And yet, when you're starving, you eat what you're given. The common peasant meal during winter was pottage, a sort of stew made by boiling whatever ingredients were available. In summer it could be hearty, with greens, grains, and sometimes meat. In winter, pottage was often a thin, watery soup with a few shriveled vegetables floating in it. Families stretched ingredients as far as they could. A single onion might flavor a pot for days, and bones were boiled again and again until every last bit of fat and flavor was gone. Imagine sitting down night after night to a steaming bowl of bland cabbage water. That was survival. Meat was rare. A pig slaughtered in November might be salted down and stored in barrels, but by January the taste was harsh, the fat rancid. If you were lucky enough to have cheese, it would be sharp and hard, having aged in a cellar. Milk was almost non-existent in winter because cows produced less when feed was scarce. Eggs too were a rarity, chickens didn't lay much in the cold and dark. Honey, if harvested in the fall, might last through winter, but it was considered a luxury, not a staple. And then there were pests. Grain stores attracted rodents, and rodents carried disease. Cats helped, but they couldn't catch them all. Every winter, families fought a losing battle against rats eating their survival supplies. A single family of rats could consume pounds of grain in a short time. Picture yourself waking in the night to hear gnawing in the granary, knowing that every sound was your food disappearing. It was maddening, and there was little you could do. Traps existed, but they weren't effective enough. Poison wasn't widely available. Rats won, again and again. Even when food didn't spoil, there was never enough of it. Winter diets lacked variety, and that meant deficiencies. Without fresh fruits or leafy greens, vitamin shortages were common. People became weak, tired, and more vulnerable to illness. Modern doctors would recognize scurvy, rickets, or anemia, but medieval people just saw it as bad luck or God's will. In reality, their bodies were simply running out of the nutrients needed to survive. The fear of famine hung over every winter. A poor harvest meant starvation for many, and harvests were unpredictable. A wet summer ruined grain. A locust swarm destroyed crops. An early frost cut the growing season short. If you went into winter with less food than usual, you knew the months ahead would be desperate. And famine wasn't just a rare event, it happened regularly throughout medieval Europe. Whole villages starved, and the memory of those winters was passed down in stories. Parents told their children about years when neighbors died in the snow, or when entire families were found lifeless, their food gone weeks before spring arrived. When hunger grew severe, people turned to desperate measures. Foraging in winter was nearly impossible, berries were gone, mushrooms buried, nuts already eaten by animals. People boiled tree bark to make a bitter paste. They ground acorns into meal, despite the stomach pains it caused. Some even ate grass or roots dug from frozen ground, just to have something in their bellies. And in the darkest accounts, there were whispers of cannibalism during the worst famines. Those may sound like legends, but chronicles from the period describe people eating the bodies of the dead when hunger drove them past sanity. We also can't forget the psychological toll. Hunger gnaws at the mind as much as the body. Imagine going to bed with your stomach aching every night, waking up weaker each morning, and rationing every bite of food you put in your mouth. Families argued over portions. Parents gave their meals to children and starved quietly. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who might steal from their stores. In small villages, a single theft could mean someone else's death. Trust evaporated under the pressure of hunger. This reality is what made winter so terrifying. You weren't just fighting the cold, you were fighting a clock that ticked down with every handful of grain, every shriveled cabbage, every salted strip of pork. By March, food stores were nearly gone, and people counted the days until the first signs of spring growth. Nettles and wild greens sprouting in April were celebrated like a feast because they meant fresh food had returned. Until then, survival meant scraping by with whatever scraps remained. Now, think about yourself in that position. You're used to opening a fridge full of choices. If you want strawberries in January, you can buy them, flown in from across the world. You snack without thinking about tomorrow. In the Middle Ages, that was unthinkable. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was a constant source of fear. Every bite was weighed against what was left in the storehouse. Every day you ate, you wondered if you had enough for the next. So when we talk about why you wouldn't survive a medieval winter, food storage is at the top of the list. Not only would you hate the taste and monotony of what was available, but the simple truth is that there wouldn't be enough to keep you alive. Hunger was a shadow that followed every family, every village, every year. And no matter how well they prepared, winter always demanded more than they had. If food storage was already a struggle, the daily meals people actually ate during a medieval winter tell the story even more vividly. Because this is where survival stopped being an abstract fear and became a physical reality felt in every bite. For us today, a meal means variety, taste, even comfort. Breakfast is eggs, toast, coffee. Lunch is a sandwich, maybe a salad. Dinner might be a hot stew, a plate of pasta, or whatever your favorite takeout place offers. But in the Middle Ages, especially during winter, meals weren't about comfort. They were about staying alive with whatever scraps you had left. And the truth is, if you sat down at a medieval winter table, you'd probably push the bowl away after a few spoonfuls. The backbone of every meal was bread. But this wasn't fluffy sourdough or soft rolls with butter. By winter, bread was hard, coarse, and often bitter. It was made from rye, barley, or oats instead of wheat, because wheat was expensive and usually reserved for the rich. In bad years, bakers stretched flour with beans, peas, or even ground up acorns. Sometimes straw or sawdust was mixed in to bulk up loaves. It wasn't nutritious, and it certainly wasn't tasty, but it filled the stomach. Bread was often baked in huge batches at the start of the week, then rationed out day by day. By the end of the week, it was so stale it had to be dunked into liquid just to be chewable. And what liquid was available? The answer was usually pottage. Pottage was the universal medieval dish, a sort of soup or stew that simmered on the hearth from morning to night. Families would throw whatever they had into the pot: grain, beans, cabbage, onions, maybe a bone for flavor, and it would keep bubbling all day. Every time someone was hungry, they dipped in and took a portion. In summer, pottage might have been thicker, with fresh herbs and vegetables. In winter, it was thin, watery, and bland. Imagine a pot of cabbage water flavored faintly by a single onion. That could be your lunch, your dinner, and your breakfast the next morning, reheated for the 100th time. Meat was a luxury. A pig might be slaughtered in late autumn and salted down, but salted pork quickly became tough and overly salty. It was boiled to soften it, but the flavor was harsh. Beef was rare for peasants, and chicken was usually kept alive for eggs rather than slaughtered for meat. If you were lucky, you might eat bacon occasionally, but by January it was more fat than flesh. Fish was more common, especially in coastal regions or near rivers, but in winter, fishing was dangerous and often impossible with frozen waterways. Preserved fish, like dried herring, was available in some areas, but it tasted like leather soaked in salt. For peasants far from trade routes, fish was a rarity, not a staple. Dairy didn't fare much better. Milk was scarce in winter because cows produced less when they had little to eat. Butter was churned during the warmer months, but by winter it was often gone, unless you were wealthy enough to store it in cool cellars. Cheese, on the other hand, could be preserved, but it hardened with age. Imagine biting into a block of cheese so tough you had to cut it with a knife and chew for minutes just to soften it in your mouth. That was winter cheese, sharp, dense, and often covered in mold that had to be scraped off before eating. And fruit? Forget it. Apples and pears harvested in autumn could last into December if carefully stored, but by January they were gone. Oranges, bananas, and other fruits we take for granted today were completely unknown to medieval peasants. Dried fruit existed, raisins, figs, dates, but those were imported luxuries reserved for monasteries, nobles, and the wealthy. For everyone else, fruit simply disappeared for months at a time. So, what did an average day's meals actually look like in January or February? Breakfast, if you even had it, was usually just bread and ale. Not ale like we think of it, but small ale, a weak beer with low alcohol that was safer to drink than water. It gave some calories, but it wasn't filling. Lunch might be a bowl of thin pottage, with bread to soak it up. Dinner was more pottage, reheated again. If your family was doing well, maybe there was a slice of salted pork or some dried beans mixed in. If not, it was just broth and vegetables. Day after day, week after week, that was your diet. And the portions weren't large. Food was rationed carefully because everyone knew the supply had to last until spring. Children were fed first, then adults. Parents often gave up their own portions to keep their children alive. People ate until they weren't hungry, not until they were satisfied. Hunger was always there in the background. It never fully went away. You learned to live with it, to expect it, to ignore the ache in your stomach. For us today, used to full plates and snacks whenever we feel like it, that constant, gnawing emptiness would be almost unbearable. Malnutrition slowly wore people down. Without enough vitamins, bodies weakened. Teeth rotted faster, bones grew brittle, and wounds healed slowly. Children grew thin and sickly. The elderly wasted away. In wealthy households, things were better. Nobles feasted even in winter, with salted meats, imported spices, and stores of wine. But for the vast majority, meals were monotonous, sparse, and unsatisfying. Eating wasn't a pleasure, it was just another reminder of survival. There was also a psychological side to it. Imagine sitting down with your family night after night, staring into the same pot of watery stew, knowing that's all you had. No change in taste, no anticipation of something new, just the same thin meal day after day. Food, which today is a source of joy and comfort, was in the Middle Ages a reminder of fear and scarcity. Every bite was calculated against how many mouths it had to feed and how many days were left before spring. And don't forget spoilage. Even preserved food wasn't safe. A barrel of salted meat might go bad if not packed properly. Grain could rot in damp conditions. Vegetables stored in a cellar could sprout or mold. By February, much of what was left was barely edible. People cut away mold, scraped rot from cheese, and boiled food again and again to kill whatever had started growing in it. Hunger forced them to eat things that tasted foul, smelled worse, and sometimes made them sick. That's why medieval records are full of famine accounts. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is a famous example. Rains ruined crops, food stores ran out, and people starved across Europe. Those weren't isolated disasters, they were extensions of what winter always threatened. For peasants, every winter had the potential to become a famine year. It just depended on how well the harvest had gone and how harsh the cold became. Think about how different this is from your own life. If you're hungry now, you can walk to the kitchen, grab something from the fridge, order food online, or head to a store. You have choices. You don't think twice about variety. You probably even crave specific flavors when you're bored. In the medieval winter, cravings didn't exist. You ate what you had, and you were grateful for it, even if it was just a stale crust of bread dipped in lukewarm cabbage broth. So, when we talk about daily meals in winter, we're really talking about a slow grind of hunger, monotony, and despair. Meals weren't events. They weren't shared moments of joy around the table. They were reminders that the season was long, the supplies were short, and the only goal was to make it to spring. And for many families, that goal wasn't met. They sat down at meals day after day, bowls growing emptier, until one morning the fire burned low, the pot was empty, and there was nothing left to eat. This was life in a medieval winter. Not feasts in candlelit halls, not merry songs around long tables, but hunger. Hunger in the morning, hunger at night, hunger that never left. And if you think you could stomach that for months, day after day, you'd quickly realize that your willpower wouldn't be enough. Your body would give in long before the snow melted. Up to this point, we've been talking about the struggles of cold houses, thin clothing, and bland meals. But beneath all of those hardships sat a deeper, more terrifying truth, the looming fear of famine. This wasn't just an occasional nightmare for medieval people. It was the shadow that followed them through every winter. Hunger was expected, yes, but famine was the monster that could arrive at any moment, swallowing villages whole and leaving nothing but stories of misery behind. And the hardest part? Nobody ever knew which winter would be the one that tipped into disaster. Let's imagine this clearly. It's late December. The first storms have passed, the food stores are holding, and you're surviving on the same daily bread and pottage routine. Things aren't comfortable, but they're manageable. Now imagine the weeks dragging on into January and February. The barrels of salted pork are getting low. The sacks of grain you thought would last until spring are already half empty. And as you sit by the fire scraping the last crumbs of bread from the table, you begin to realize you might not make it. This is when the fear of famine begins to take root, and it's not something you can escape. Famine wasn't rare in the Middle Ages, it was a recurring reality. Every few decades, sometimes every few years, bad harvests, harsh winters, or flooding rains would destroy crops and leave entire regions starving. One of the most infamous examples was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Continuous rain ruined harvests, livestock diseases spread, and grain supplies collapsed. People across Europe starved by the tens of thousands. But smaller famines haunted villages all the time. A single bad harvest in your area was enough to doom your community. There were no international shipments of grain, no relief programs, no government aid. You were on your own, with only what your lord or neighbors could spare, and often, they couldn't spare much. The fear of famine shaped people's minds. Every decision in autumn, how much food to store, how much to ration, whether to slaughter a pig now or try to keep it alive until spring, was weighed against the possibility of famine. Imagine that level of anxiety stretching over months. Every bite you took wasn't just food. It was a calculation. Do you eat more tonight and risk not having enough in February? Do you give the last apple to your child, knowing you won't taste fruit again until spring? Every choice was survival math, and the stakes were always life and death. As food stores dwindled, hunger deepened. Hunger in the Middle Ages wasn't the hunger we know today, when you miss a meal or two and feel weak. It was a grinding, relentless ache that hollowed out your body. Stomachs shrank, ribs showed, and skin turned pale and thin. People became listless, their energy gone, unable to work or even gather more wood. Hunger made them desperate. Theft increased in winters when famine loomed. Neighbors who once shared tools or worked side by side in the fields began to eye each other with suspicion. Grain barns were guarded like treasure chests. A handful of stolen flour could mean your child lived another day. And famine didn't just mean hunger, it meant death in staggering numbers. The weakest went first: children, the elderly, the sick. Entire families might vanish before spring. Priests recorded mass burials during famine years. Chroniclers described parents forced to abandon children, or children wandering into the woods, never to return. And while these accounts sound distant and historical, they were the lived reality for countless medieval families. Death by famine was slow, humiliating, and inescapable once it began. There are chilling stories from the period that bring this fear into focus. Some chronicles tell of people grinding up acorns, bark, or weeds to make a bitter bread that offered little nutrition but filled the stomach for a few hours. Others describe peasants boiling the hides of old shoes or leather straps, scraping off whatever protein remained. During the Great Famine, there were whispers, recorded by horrified monks, of cannibalism, families eating the bodies of the dead when starvation pushed them beyond reason. Whether every detail was true or exaggerated doesn't matter. The fact that people believed it happened shows how deep the terror of famine ran. This fear didn't vanish even in better years. Every time snow fell heavily or ice covered the rivers, people felt the shadow of famine nearby. A delayed spring meant the hungry months stretched longer. Crops planted too late might fail, pushing the famine forward into another year. It wasn't just about what was on the table tonight, it was about what might never be on the table tomorrow. That dread was constant, a drumbeat that echoed through the long nights. Famine also changed the social landscape. In times of plenty, villages could function with cooperation and trust. But when famine threatened, the social order broke down. People abandoned farms and wandered in search of food. Families who had something left locked their doors and refused to share. Lords, who were supposed to provide protection, often demanded taxes in grain even during famine, leaving peasants to starve so their masters could eat. Resentment simmered, but rebellion was dangerous. The fear of punishment balanced against the fear of starvation, and in the end, most people suffered silently. Religion played a large role in how people understood famine. Many saw it as God's punishment for sin, a divine judgment that could only be eased through prayer, fasting, or penance. Priests led processions, calling for forgiveness and mercy. But for the average person, the prayers often felt hollow when their stomach growled louder than the church bells. Faith was a comfort, but it didn't put bread on the table. The fear of famine wasn't eased by religion, it was only made more frightening by the idea that God himself had turned against you. The psychological weight was immense. Imagine lying in bed at night, hearing your children whimper with hunger, knowing you had nothing to give them. Imagine watching the food stores shrink day after day, counting loaves of bread and calculating how many days each one might stretch. Imagine waking up in February, looking at the snow still thick outside, and realizing that you might not make it to April. That is what famine meant in the Middle Ages, not just empty stomachs, but empty hope. This is where modern people would break quickly. We're used to abundance, to safety nets, to the idea that food is always available somewhere. In a medieval winter, that wasn't true. You couldn't drive to a store. You couldn't call for help. If the grain was gone, it was gone. If the pottage pot was empty, you simply went to bed hungry. And if your neighbors were in the same situation, there was no one to turn to. Hunger didn't just weaken the body, it broke communities, eroded trust, and left people feeling utterly alone in their struggle. So when we say you wouldn't survive a medieval winter, famine is one of the clearest reasons why. Even if you managed the cold, even if you endured the drafty houses and the bland meals, famine was always there waiting. It was the silent predator, creeping closer every day as your supplies dwindled. It turned ordinary winters into nightmares and left scars on entire generations. And the worst part? Nobody ever forgot famine. Children who lived through one carried the fear into adulthood. Parents told stories of the winters when neighbors starved, when whole villages died, when the fields yielded nothing but mud. That collective memory haunted medieval society. It shaped their culture, their religion, even their art. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a test of survival. And famine was the question that most people could never answer. When you think about surviving winter, food is the first thing that comes to mind. But there's something just as important that we rarely consider: water. In the modern world, water is almost invisible in our routines. You turn on a tap and there it is, clear, safe, endless. You buy a bottle at a store, chilled and clean. You can drink as much as you like without worrying where the next glass is coming from. But in the medieval world, especially in winter, water wasn't just inconvenient. It was a constant struggle, and often it was dangerous. If you had to live through a medieval winter, the simple act of drinking could be what killed you. The first problem was obvious: water sources froze. Streams, ponds, and wells that provided water during the warmer months became icy and inaccessible. Villagers hacked through frozen surfaces with axes, hoping to scoop out a bucketful before it froze again. Wells were better, but even they could freeze at the top or become contaminated in the damp winter. Imagine walking half a mile in the cold, hauling a wooden bucket, only to find the surface covered in thick ice. You'd break it, draw up water that was frigid and often murky, and carry it back, sloshing, heavy, numbing your hands as you trudged through snow. That was daily life. And the water itself wasn't clean. People bathed rarely, animals roamed freely, waste was dumped into rivers, and there were no purification systems. Water carried parasites and diseases, typhoid, dysentery, cholera in later centuries. Drinking it directly was always a gamble. In summer, the risk was bad enough. In winter, when your body was already weak from hunger and cold, contaminated water could finish you off quickly. Stomach cramps, diarrhea, dehydration, it sounds like a miserable flu today, but back then it was deadly. And yet people had no choice. They needed liquid to survive, and unsafe water was often the only option. This is where ale came in. One of the great myths of the Middle Ages is that everyone drank beer all the time because they loved it. The truth is more practical: ale was safer than water. Even weak ale, called small ale, involved boiling water during brewing, which killed some of the pathogens. It also had a bit of alcohol, which made it harder for bacteria to thrive. This meant that a mug of ale was often less risky than a bucket of water. So yes, even children drank ale. Not because people wanted them tipsy, but because it was liquid that wouldn't make them violently ill. But ale wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the hoppy craft beer we think of today. Small ale was weak, sour, and often went stale within days. It had to be brewed constantly. Households, especially peasants, brewed their own in small batches, using whatever grain they had. In winter, when grain was scarce, ale was thin and bitter. Some villages had communal brewers, often women, who provided ale for households, but quality varied wildly. You never knew if the ale you drank would taste half decent or if it would be a flat, vinegary sludge. But you drank it anyway, because it was safer than the well. Wine existed, of course, but it was for the wealthy or for regions where grapes grew. Even then, winter wine wasn't aged and refined, it was sour, cloudy, and often watered down. Nobles might spice it, creating hot drinks like mulled wine, which actually helped in the cold. But peasants rarely saw wine except at church, where priests used it for mass. And even then, the sip they received was symbolic, not enough to quench thirst. Another winter drink was mead, made from honey. But honey itself was precious, and mead was more a luxury than a daily staple. Cider existed in some regions, but like wine, it was seasonal and limited. The everyday reality was ale for most people, and even that required precious grain. In the hardest winters, when grain supplies ran low, ale production slowed or stopped altogether, forcing people back to unsafe water. Imagine the despair, not only was food gone, but now even your drink carried risk. And then there was snow. Melting snow might sound like an easy solution, but it wasn't practical for most medieval families. Melting snow required fuel, and fuel was scarce. Every stick of wood, every lump of peat, every piece of dried dung was already needed to heat the house or cook what little food there was. Boiling snow for drinking water was a last resort, not a daily habit. And melted snow often carried dirt, soot, and animal droppings, depending on where it was collected. You might think you were drinking pure frozen water, but in reality, it was often contaminated too. The struggle with water and drinks wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Thirst is harder to ignore than hunger. Hunger gnaws at you, but thirst burns. Your lips crack, your tongue dries, your body aches for moisture. Imagine being stuck in a medieval winter, surrounded by ice and snow, yet still desperately thirsty because you couldn't safely drink what was around you. The frustration would be unbearable. You'd look at snowdrifts outside your door and know that turning them into drinkable water would cost you the fuel you needed to keep your family alive overnight. Every decision was a trade-off. Do you stay warm, or do you quench your thirst? Even the act of drinking wasn't simple. Cups and vessels weren't always clean. Families shared mugs, dipping into the same bucket or pot. Germs spread easily, especially in crowded homes. If one person got sick, it often spread to everyone else. And with weak immune systems already struggling in winter, that shared cup of ale or water might carry more danger than comfort. The wealthy handled this problem better, of course. Nobles had access to better wine, spiced and warmed in large hearth halls. They had more fuel to spare for boiling water. They had servants to fetch fresh supplies from protected wells. But even in castles, water was often contaminated, and ale was still the safer choice. Luxury didn't eliminate risk, it just lessened it. This struggle for safe drinks also influenced medieval culture. Alehouses became central to village life, not just because people wanted to socialize, but because they needed a constant supply of liquid. Brewing was one of the few jobs women could reliably hold, and alewives were vital in every community. Church records often mention disputes over bad ale or unfair pricing, because it wasn't just about taste, it was about survival. A weak or spoiled batch could mean illness for an entire household. Think about how alien this is to us. Today, the thought of being forced to drink only weak beer all winter with no clean water available sounds bizarre. But for medieval people, it was reality. If you time travel to that world, the first sip of well water might make you violently sick. You'd learn quickly why even children drank ale. And the constant sour taste in your mouth would remind you that this wasn't about enjoyment. It was about living through another day. And in the background of it all was the simple, crushing irony: surrounded by ice and snow, you might still die of thirst. Not because water wasn't there, but because it was never safe, never easy, never guaranteed. Just like food, drink in a medieval winter wasn't about choice or pleasure. It was about survival, and even then, survival was never promised. When we think about winter survival, clothing is one of the first things that comes to mind. Today, it's easy to underestimate how crucial it really is because modern clothing technology has spoiled us. We have waterproof jackets, insulated boots, fleece-lined pants, thermal underwear, and socks made with synthetic fibers that trap heat while wicking away moisture. We can order all of it online, in whatever size we want, and it arrives neatly packaged within days. But step back 700 years, into the heart of a medieval winter, and clothing was not a matter of style or comfort. It was a matter of life and death. And for most peasants, what they had was simply not enough. Let's start with the basics. Most medieval people owned only a few garments. Clothing wasn't mass-produced. Every piece was hand-stitched, woven on looms, or bought at markets at high cost. A single wool tunic might take weeks to produce. For a peasant family, owning more than one or two outfits was rare. Clothes were patched and mended over and over until they were nearly rags. That meant you wore the same things every day, in every season, year after year. And when winter arrived, you simply layered what you had, no matter how worn or ill-fitting. Wool was the most common material. It was warm, at least when dry, and sheep were abundant. Peasants wore thick woolen tunics, cloaks, and hose. Underneath, linen shirts or shifts were worn next to the skin. But linen wasn't insulating, it absorbed sweat and quickly felt clammy. Wool, while insulating, was heavy and itchy. Once it got wet, whether from snow, rain, or sweat, it clung to the body and took forever to dry. Imagine walking home from the fields with snow melting into your cloak, only to hang it by the fire and put it back on damp the next morning. That was daily life. Footwear was another weak point. Shoes were simple leather turn shoes, soft, flat, and not waterproof. They might keep your feet covered, but they offered almost no protection from snow or ice. Socks, as we know them, didn't exist. People wrapped their feet in strips of cloth or stuffed straw inside their shoes for insulation. The straw flattened quickly and had to be replaced often. By January, feet were cracked, raw, and often frostbitten. Imagine trudging through frozen mud with leather shoes soaked through, your toes numb and burning. That was the medieval experience of winter walking. For warmth indoors, people relied on cloaks and blankets. A heavy woolen cloak was a lifeline. It could be worn outside, used as a blanket at night, or hung over doorways to block drafts. Furs were highly valued too, but they weren't as common for peasants. Rabbit, fox, or sheepskin might be worn as trim or lining, but full fur garments were expensive. Nobles and wealthy merchants could drape themselves in ermine, sable, or bear fur, creating thick, luxurious layers that actually provided decent insulation. Peasants, meanwhile, were lucky if they had a single sheepskin cloak to share between family members. Head coverings were essential. Heat escapes quickly from the head, and medieval people knew this well. Hoods and coifs, simple linen or wool caps, were worn almost constantly. A hood could be pulled up to cover the neck and shoulders, creating an extra barrier against wind. At night, people often slept with their heads covered, because the cold air indoors was almost as harsh as the outdoors. Hands were harder to protect. Gloves existed, but for peasants, they were rare. Mittens of wool or leather were used when possible, but most work was done barehanded, even in freezing weather. Numb fingers were a fact of life. Now picture how much harder survival became when you owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothing. You couldn't afford to ruin them, yet winter ruined everything. Walking through slush wore holes in shoes. Carrying wood tore seams in cloaks. The constant dampness wore fabric thin. Repair was constant. Women spent endless hours mending clothes, patching wool, darning hose, and stitching leather. Clothing was passed down through generations, worn until it was little more than scraps. There was no concept of fashion in the peasant household, just survival. For wealthier households, the story was different, but only slightly. Nobles had multiple garments, often layered extravagantly, undershirts, padded tunics, lined cloaks, and furs. They had tall boots lined with wool or fur, and servants to dry them by the fire. Their warmth came not just from clothing, but from sheer abundance. They could afford to have several cloaks drying while they wore others, or to replace garments when they wore out. But even in castles, the cold was felt. Huge stone halls were drafty, and tapestries on the walls served not just as decoration but as insulation. Nobles still slept in layers of blankets and fur. The difference was, they didn't face frostbite daily like peasants did. Children had it the worst. They grew quickly, so clothing was always too small, too worn, or borrowed from siblings. A child might spend an entire winter in garments that barely fit, with no shoes or only scraps tied around their feet. Many didn't survive. Elderly people were also vulnerable, their bodies too frail to withstand long exposure. The lack of adequate clothing, combined with malnutrition, meant that each winter claimed lives, no matter how well families prepared. And then there's the question of laundry. In winter, washing clothes was nearly impossible. Water was frozen, soap was scarce, and drying anything in the cold took forever. People wore the same garments day and night for weeks. Clothes became stiff with dirt, smoke, and sweat. They smelled strongly of the animals they came from. Sheep wool never lost its odor, even when washed. For us today, the idea of pulling on the same scratchy, smoky tunic day after day would be intolerable. For them, it was just normal. Warmth wasn't just about clothes, it was about how you used them. At night, families huddled together under whatever blankets they had. Straw mattresses offered some insulation from the frozen ground, but drafts seeped through every crack in the house. People layered cloaks, stuffed hay into bedding, and even slept with animals for body heat. You might wake with frost on your blanket, your breath visible in the air. And in the morning, you'd put your stiff, cold clothes back on, because there was no other choice. This is the part of a medieval winter that breaks the modern imagination. We are used to comfort. We turn up the thermostat, pull on fresh socks, wrap ourselves in fleece blankets. But in a medieval home, warmth was never guaranteed. It was a constant battle between thin clothing and relentless cold. And it was a battle people often lost. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Hypothermia crept in slowly, especially for children and the elderly. Weak bodies couldn't generate enough heat, and inadequate clothing offered no protection. So when you imagine yourself waking up in a medieval winter, don't picture yourself cozy in a fur cloak by the fire. Picture yourself in a single wool tunic, stiff leather shoes, and a patched cloak that smells of smoke and sheep. Picture your hands numb, your feet raw, your body shivering as you walk outside to fetch water or firewood. Picture climbing into bed at night with all your clothes still on, teeth chattering, huddling against your family just to make it through until morning. That was medieval warmth, not comfort, not coziness, but the bare minimum required to keep breathing. And even then, it often wasn't enough. So far we've talked about cold houses, thin clothing, meager meals, and the looming shadow of famine. But there's another reason you wouldn't survive a medieval winter, and it's one that doesn't get mentioned as much in romanticized versions of the past: the constant, creeping presence of disease. In a world without modern medicine, without hospitals, without antibiotics, without even the most basic understanding of germs, the winter season was a breeding ground for sickness. And sickness, more than the cold itself, was often what tipped people over the edge. Let's set the scene. It's January. You're living in a one-room cottage with your family. The fire is small, the air is thick with smoke, and the windows are sealed tight to keep out the draft. But sealing out the draft also means sealing in everything else: the damp air, the stench of unwashed bodies, the fumes from burning wood and dung, the smells of animals sleeping in the corner, and the sour odor of old food. That air is heavy. It clings to your lungs. And every time someone coughs, the sound echoes in the enclosed space, spreading whatever illness they carry to everyone else. Respiratory infections were everywhere. Today, you catch a cold and you grumble about it for a few days. Back then, a cold could kill you. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza-like illnesses spread easily in winter, and without treatment, they were often fatal. A child with a fever might not wake up the next morning. An elderly person with a cough might decline rapidly, their lungs filling with fluid as the family watched helplessly. Even strong adults could be taken down within weeks by what started as a simple sore throat or runny nose. And it wasn't just respiratory illness. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making the body less capable of fighting off anything. Without vitamins, wounds healed slowly, and infections set in quickly. A small cut on your hand, maybe from chopping wood or handling tools, could become red and swollen within days. Pus would build, pain would spread, and without antibiotics, there was little you could do. Sometimes the body fought it off. Often it didn't. Sepsis, blood poisoning, gangrene, these weren't rare accidents. They were part of life. And in winter, when the body was already weak, they were more deadly than ever. The medieval world was also a world of lice, fleas, and parasites. In winter, when everyone was crammed together in close quarters, infestations were constant. People scratched at their skin until it bled. Lice spread typhus, a disease that caused fever, rash, and delirium, and which killed many during harsh winters. Fleas spread other infections, and while the Black Death wasn't a yearly occurrence, its memory loomed large in the medieval imagination. Even in quieter years, parasites carried their own toll: itching, sores, and a constant drain on health. Then there was the smoke. Every house relied on fire for warmth and cooking, but medieval fireplaces and hearths were inefficient and poorly ventilated. Many homes didn't even have chimneys, just a hole in the roof to let the smoke drift out. That meant that every meal, every night by the fire, filled the lungs with smoke. Today, we know the dangers of long-term smoke inhalation. Back then, it was unavoidable. Children grew up coughing. Adults developed chronic breathing problems. The combination of smoke, damp, and cold turned every winter into a season of respiratory misery. Stomach illnesses were another curse. Remember that water wasn't clean. Ale was safer, but it wasn't always available, especially when grain was scarce. Drinking water contaminated with waste or rot often led to diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration. In a time when medical care was non-existent, dehydration could kill quickly, especially in children. A winter stomach bug wasn't just unpleasant, it was a family tragedy waiting to happen. We also can't forget epidemics. While not every winter brought plague, disease outbreaks were common. Dysentery swept through villages, leaving people weak and bedridden. Smallpox struck with terrifying regularity, disfiguring survivors and killing many. Measles, whooping cough, and other contagious illnesses thrived in the cramped, unhygienic conditions. A single sick visitor could infect an entire household. And without modern understanding of quarantine or transmission, people often made it worse by gathering in churches, markets, or feasts during the holiday season. For women, winter carried additional dangers. Childbirth was always risky, but in winter, the risks multiplied. Cold weakened the body. Poor nutrition made recovery harder. Infections spread quickly in unsanitary conditions. A woman giving birth in January or February faced not only the usual dangers of hemorrhage or obstructed labor, but also the heightened chance of dying from postpartum infections in a world without sterile tools or knowledge of hygiene. The mortality rate was staggering, and winter only amplified it. Mental health, though not understood in medieval terms, also suffered. Today, we talk about seasonal depression, the winter blues, and the toll of long nights with little sunlight. Medieval people felt it too. They didn't have the words for it, but they described the despair, the hopelessness, the sense of being trapped. Combined with hunger and illness, that despair could be overwhelming. People lost the will to fight, to get out of bed, to gather firewood. Families whispered about those who seemed to fade away, not from famine or visible sickness, but from sheer exhaustion and hopelessness. And when death came, it wasn't clean or gentle. Medieval winters were full of funerals. Graves were dug in frozen ground when possible, or bodies were kept in barns until the thaw. Families mourned constantly. The sound of church bells tolling for the dead was a regular background to winter life. Children grew up expecting to see siblings die. Parents carried the grief of losing child after child. Communities shrank each winter, and each spring was marked by the question, who didn't make it? Now picture yourself in that environment. You wake up coughing in a smoky room, your chest tight, your nose running. You're weak from lack of food, your body shivering under thin wool. A fever sets in. There are no painkillers, no antibiotics, no doctors to call. Maybe someone brings you a bitter herbal drink, or lays you by the fire and prays. But that's all. If your body can't fight it, you die. Slowly, painfully, in the same room where your family continues to huddle for warmth. This wasn't an exception, it was the rule. Winter disease didn't just take the unlucky. It took everyone eventually. That's why modern people wouldn't last. We've been raised with vaccines, antibiotics, hospitals, and sanitation. We don't think twice about colds or cuts because we know they won't kill us. But in a medieval winter, every cough could be your last, every scratch could become infected, every sip of water could make you sick. You wouldn't need famine to finish you off. Illness alone would be enough. And the worst part? People accepted it. They didn't like it, but they understood it as part of life. Death in winter was expected. Disease was inevitable. Children were baptized quickly after birth because parents knew many wouldn't survive even their first cold season. Families prayed and endured because there was nothing else they could do. To us, that helplessness is unthinkable. To them, it was reality. So when you imagine a medieval winter, don't picture just cold nights and empty bellies. Picture the sound of coughing in the dark, the sight of pale faces huddled by the fire, the smell of smoke and sickness filling the room. Picture families burying their dead before the ground froze solid. That was the true heart of winter in the Middle Ages. And that's why, no matter how tough you think you are, you wouldn't survive. So far, we've stayed mostly inside the medieval home, the smoky fires, the stale bread, the damp clothing, the coughing children. But not every part of survival in winter was about staying indoors. Sometimes, you had no choice but to step outside. Maybe you needed more firewood. Maybe you had to check on your livestock. Maybe you had to fetch water or travel to a nearby village for trade, church, or news. And this is where another brutal truth of a medieval winter comes in: travel was dangerous. Not inconvenient, not unpleasant, dangerous in a way that most of us today cannot even begin to imagine. Let's picture the roads. In summer, they were already rough, dirt tracks full of ruts, mud holes, and loose stones. By winter, they turned into hazards. Snow covered the paths, erasing the lines between road and ditch. Ice made every step slippery. Rain froze into hard ruts, catching wagon wheels and snapping axles. In some regions, whole sections of road flooded and then froze solid, leaving jagged, uneven ground that was nearly impossible to cross. If you set out on a journey in January, you weren't strolling through a picturesque snowy lane, you were walking into a minefield of hazards that could leave you stranded miles from home. And you couldn't just stay home forever. Villages were small and self-sufficient, but they weren't sealed off completely. Trade still had to happen. People still had to carry grain to the mill for grinding, or bring their goods to market. Priests still traveled between parishes. Messengers still delivered news. Winter slowed everything, but it didn't stop it. And every time someone had to set out, danger followed. Walking was the most common way to travel, and in winter, it was grueling. Imagine trudging through knee-deep snow with thin leather shoes, your feet freezing with each step. The wind cuts through your cloak, snowflakes sting your face, and every breath feels like ice in your lungs. Paths weren't cleared, and if the snow was heavy enough, the road simply disappeared. You could get lost within minutes, even in familiar territory. Villagers sometimes tied ropes between houses and barns so they wouldn't lose their way in blizzards. Out in the open, you didn't have that protection. You could wander off the path without realizing it, and in the whiteout of winter, that mistake could be fatal. Carts and wagons didn't fare much better. Wheels got stuck in frozen mud, horses slipped on ice, and axles snapped under the strain. A broken wagon on a remote road meant you were stranded in the cold with little chance of rescue. Wealthier travelers might use sleds when snow was deep, but even those required strong animals and smoother ground than most medieval roads could offer. And let's not forget the rivers. Rivers were crucial travel routes in medieval Europe, but in winter they froze over. Thin ice was deadly, try to cross too early, and you'd plunge into freezing water. Even strong swimmers rarely survived an icy fall, weighed down by heavy wool clothing. Drownings were common, and bodies sometimes weren't found until the spring thaw. The dangers weren't just natural. Bandits thrived in winter. When food was scarce, desperate men turned to robbery. A traveler on the road was an easy target. Cold, exhausted, burdened with goods, they could be ambushed and stripped of everything, including their cloak, their shoes, even their life. Wolves added another threat. In some regions, wolf packs grew bold in harsh winters, drawn closer to villages in search of food. Travelers reported hearing howls in the distance, sometimes followed by the terrifying sight of dark shapes pacing them through the snow. Even if the wolves didn't attack, the fear alone was enough to drive people back home. And then there was the danger of isolation. If you fell ill or broke a bone on the road, there was little chance of help. Villages were miles apart, and people weren't quick to leave their homes in winter. You might collapse in the snow, unseen, your body covered by drifts before morning. Travelers often went missing, and when spring arrived, their skeletons were found by the roadside, picked clean by animals. Everyone knew someone who had gone out one winter and never returned. The psychological burden of travel in winter was heavy. Imagine needing to walk 5 miles to another village for a funeral or a wedding, knowing the risks. Families said goodbye to travelers as if they might never see them again, because often they didn't. For us today, travel is a nuisance when flights are delayed or highways are icy. For them, it was a gamble with life on the line. Even short trips were risky. Fetching water from a frozen stream could end with frostbite. Gathering firewood in a forest could leave you stranded if snow fell too heavily. Children tasked with errands sometimes didn't come back, lost in storms or falling through thin ice. Parents lived in constant fear, balancing the need for chores against the dangers of letting anyone step outside. For nobles, things were safer but not safe. A lord might travel in a carriage or on horseback with armed guards, but even then, roads were treacherous. Horses slipped, carriages overturned, guards froze in the saddle. Messages from kings and bishops were delayed for months in winter, simply because it was too dangerous to move quickly. Armies avoided winter campaigns for the same reason: travel was misery, and the risks outweighed the rewards. This all meant that winter was a season of isolation. Villages huddled in on themselves, cut off from the world. News slowed. Trade dried up. Families grew more insular, relying only on what they had stored. Loneliness set in, and with it, despair. Travel wasn't just physically risky, it cut people off from community, from markets, from the larger world. You were stuck in your village with the same people, the same food, the same problems, for months. And if you ran out of supplies, you couldn't just go find more. Now imagine yourself in that position. You're used to hopping in a car, taking a train, catching a flight. You don't think twice about the safety of travel, only the convenience. In the medieval winter, every journey outside your door was a calculated risk. Would you come back? Would the snow swallow you? Would wolves follow you? Would bandits strip you bare? Modern people, with their sense of safety and security, wouldn't last. The fear alone would keep them trapped indoors. But medieval people didn't have that choice. They had to go out, and often, they paid the price. So when we think about why you wouldn't survive a medieval winter, it's not just hunger or cold that would get you. It's the simple act of leaving your house. Travel was a danger, constant and inescapable. And every time the door opened to the howling wind, survival wasn't guaranteed. So far we've talked about hunger, sickness, and the dangers of travel, but there's another piece of the medieval winter puzzle that can't be ignored: the endless, grinding burden of work. Survival didn't pause when the snow fell. There was no winter break, no chance to sit around idly waiting for spring to arrive. In fact, in many ways, winter made the work harder, more exhausting, and more unforgiving. For people in the Middle Ages, labor wasn't just part of life, it was life. And when you combine that with the bitter cold, malnutrition, and constant fear of death, you begin to understand why surviving a medieval winter was such an impossible challenge. Imagine the world around you, the fields frozen solid, the trees bare, the rivers sluggish with ice. Farming, the main work of the year, was impossible in winter. You couldn't plow or plant, and there was nothing to harvest. But that didn't mean the workload disappeared. If anything, the nature of the labor simply shifted. Winter was a time for maintenance, preparation, and survival chores. And every task came with its own dangers. Let's start with firewood. Every home needed it, but cutting wood in winter was grueling work. Trees were felled in icy forests, axes swung with numb hands, and logs hauled back through deep snow. Each trip meant braving the cold, risking frostbite, and carrying heavy loads on weakened bodies. Without firewood, there was no warmth and no way to cook food. So men and boys dragged themselves out into the forest, coughing into the cold air, chopping until their muscles gave out. Women, too, collected brushwood and carried it home in baskets on their backs. For families, the fire was life, and keeping it alive required constant labor. Then there were the animals. Livestock couldn't graze on snow-covered fields, so they had to be fed with hay, turnips, or whatever fodder had been stored in autumn. That meant trudging into frozen barns every morning, breaking ice from troughs, carrying water, and shoveling manure in the freezing cold. Animals were as important as people in winter. They provided milk, meat, wool, and leather. If they died, families starved. So farmers worked tirelessly to keep them alive, often sacrificing their own rations so animals could eat. A cow in January was the difference between life and death in March. Inside the home, work never ended. Women were expected to mend clothes, patch shoes, spin wool, weave cloth, and prepare meals, all with freezing fingers in smoky rooms. Bread had to be baked, even if the flour was stretched thin with fillers. Pottage had to be stirred, even if the pot was little more than flavored water. Children helped, carrying water, tending fires, and caring for siblings. No one was idle. To be idle in winter was to invite death. And then there were the crafts. Winter was the season for work that couldn't be done in the fields. Blacksmiths continued forging tools and shoeing horses, though their forges were icy and their hands stiff. Carpenters repaired wagons, made furniture, and built tools, often by candlelight in freezing workshops. Weavers, spinners, and cobblers worked late into the night, trying to make goods to sell when markets reopened. But these weren't cozy hobbies. They were survival. If a tool broke in winter, you couldn't just replace it at a store. You needed the blacksmith to fix it. If your shoes wore through, you needed the cobbler's work to keep your feet from freezing. Every craft mattered, and every craftsman worked until exhaustion. Even the wealthy weren't free from winter chores. Nobles had servants, yes, but those servants still had to fetch water, haul wood, and tend fires around massive, drafty castles. Kitchens worked constantly to prepare salted meats, thin soups, and breads for entire households. Servants scurried from hall to hall carrying torches and buckets, often freezing despite the layers of clothes they wore. Nobles themselves might not lift a finger, but their comfort depended on dozens of exhausted laborers working from dawn until dusk. And remember, dawn came late in winter, and dusk arrived early. That meant long nights by candlelight or firelight, trying to keep up with tasks despite the darkness. I strained in dim light, and accidents were common. A dropped needle, a cut finger, a burned hand, small injuries became major problems when there was no clean water, no disinfectant, no doctor. Children weren't spared either. From a young age, they were expected to help with winter chores. Boys carried wood and fetched water. Girls spun wool, patched clothes, and helped in the kitchen. By modern standards, these were adult responsibilities, but for medieval families, children's work was essential. If a child shirked their duties, the whole family suffered. Childhood wasn't a time of play, it was training for survival. And winter forced that lesson earlier than any other season. The physical strain of winter work was punishing. Malnourished bodies struggled to carry heavy loads. Weak muscles trembled under the weight of water buckets and bundles of wood. Hands cracked and bled from exposure to cold and constant labor. Feet blistered from long walks in thin shoes. Backs ached from bending, lifting, chopping, and carrying. And there was no rest. If you stopped, you froze. If you paused too long, the fire died, the animals starved, or your children went without food. Work wasn't optional, it was the only thing keeping death at bay. And all this work took place in silence and monotony. There were no radios, no podcasts, no background music. Just the sound of axes, footsteps crunching snow, coughing in the dark. The boredom mixed with exhaustion created a mental fog. Imagine spending hours weaving cloth with numb fingers, your stomach growling, your head aching from smoke. Or picture yourself trudging to the forest for wood, every step heavier than the last, knowing you'll have to do it again tomorrow. That kind of labor wears you down not just physically, but spiritually. The wealthy might have survived winter with less work, but even they weren't immune to its toll. Castles required constant upkeep. Fires had to be fed in dozens of rooms. Servants hauled water endlessly up stone staircases. Nobles spent long days indoors, but boredom and confinement bred frustration. Winter was a season of impatience, when even the privileged felt trapped by the endless cold. For most people, though, winter was simply work without end. The irony was cruel, you couldn't farm, yet you still worked harder than ever. And the rewards were meager. No matter how much you labored, you never felt warm enough, never felt full enough, never felt safe enough. Work kept you alive, but only barely. It never brought comfort. Now compare this to modern life. Today, winter work means shoveling a driveway, maybe scraping ice off your car. And even that feels exhausting. Imagine instead a world where every piece of fuel, every drop of water, every scrap of food had to be earned through back-breaking labor. No machines, no shortcuts, no safety nets. Just your body, weakened by hunger and illness, forced to keep moving because if you stopped, you died. That was the reality of winter work in the Middle Ages. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't romantic. It was brutal, repetitive, and unforgiving. And it's one more reason you wouldn't last a week in a medieval winter. When we picture a family winter night in the Middle Ages, it's tempting to romanticize it. You might imagine everyone gathered around the hearth, firelight flickering on the walls, parents telling stories while children drift off to sleep. But the reality was far less cozy. Yes, families did huddle together in winter, but not out of choice or warmth of heart. They did it because they had no other option. And when you put too many people, too many animals, and too many problems into one small, smoky room for weeks on end, the result wasn't harmony. It was tension, claustrophobia, and constant conflict. Start with the size of the house. A typical peasant family lived in a one-room cottage, maybe 2 rooms if they were fortunate. That space wasn't just for the people. In winter, animals were often brought inside for warmth. Chickens, goats, and sometimes even cows shared the living space. Their body heat helped raise the temperature a few degrees, which could mean survival. But that also meant noise, smells, and mess. Imagine trying to sleep with a goat bleating at your feet, a chicken flapping in the rafters, and the smell of manure rising from the corner. That was normal life. Privacy simply didn't exist. Parents, children, and sometimes extended relatives all slept in the same room, on straw mattresses stuffed with whatever was available. There were no bedrooms, no quiet corners, no places to escape. Everyone saw and heard everything. Arguments couldn't be avoided. Siblings squabbled over space near the fire. Parents argued over food rations. Children cried from hunger or cold, keeping everyone awake. Tired, hungry people stuck in a single room for months, of course tensions boiled over. The fire, the one source of warmth, made the situation worse. Everyone crowded close to it, jostling for the best spot. The person nearest the fire roasted uncomfortably, while those at the edges shivered. Sparks sometimes flew, landing on clothing or bedding. The smoke stung eyes and lungs, making tempers shorter. And when the fire died down at night, everyone woke shivering, blaming one another for not tending it. Something as simple as forgetting to stoke the hearth could spark a shouting match. Noise was constant. Animals clucked, mooed, or shuffled. Children whimpered. Adults coughed. The wind howled outside, rattling shutters and whistling through the cracks in the walls. Sleep was shallow and restless. With so many bodies in one room, people turned over onto each other, kicked in their sleep, or fought over blankets. Imagine being exhausted, hungry, and cold, only to be woken at midnight because someone rolled onto your arm or a chicken decided to flap at the rafters. Small annoyances quickly built into big resentments. Hygiene added to the strain. Bathing was rare in the best of times, and in winter it was nearly impossible. Water was frozen, soap was scarce, and the cold made undressing unbearable. People wore the same clothes day and night for weeks. Sweat, smoke, and animal smells clung to everything. Lice and fleas spread easily in the crowded space. Itching, scratching, and sores became common. Everyone knew it, everyone suffered from it, and everyone grew frustrated by it. The irritations of living in such close quarters made tempers flare even faster. And then there was hunger. When food was scarce, arguments about rations were inevitable. Parents gave portions to children, leaving themselves hungry. Siblings fought over scraps of bread. Families whispered about whether the food would last until spring. Desperation created bitterness. Why had the harvest been so poor? Why hadn't more been stored? Who had eaten more than their share? These weren't small arguments. In times of real famine, families sometimes fractured over food. Stories survive of relatives abandoning one another or even stealing from each other in the dead of night. The psychological toll was immense. Darkness lasted 16 hours a day. With no work in the fields and limited crafts to occupy the time, boredom set in. People stared at the fire, listening to the wind, waiting for dawn. Idleness bred frustration. Husbands snapped at wives. Parents snapped at children. Children grew restless and disobedient, only to be punished harshly for it. There was no outlet for anger, no escape from the monotony. The house became a prison, each wall closing in as the weeks dragged on. For women, the burden was doubled. They were expected to maintain order in the chaos, tending the fire, cooking thin meals, patching clothes, cleaning rushes from the floor, caring for children, and sometimes managing animals inside the house. Their labor was constant and exhausting, yet often invisible or unappreciated. Tensions between husbands and wives grew, especially when hunger made tempers short. Domestic violence, though rarely recorded in medieval documents, was a grim reality, and the claustrophobic conditions of winter only made it worse. Even the wealthy weren't free from crowding. Castles had more rooms, but they were freezing, drafty, and impossible to heat. Servants crowded into shared quarters, nobles huddled in great halls, and fires blazed but never truly warmed the space. People still lived close together, sharing beds and blankets. Privacy was a privilege almost no one truly enjoyed. Children were perhaps the most vulnerable to the emotional toll. They didn't understand rationing, or why their parents were always tired and irritable. They cried for food that wasn't there. They fought with siblings over scraps or warm spots by the fire. Many didn't survive the season, and the grief of losing a child in such crowded, suffocating conditions broke families apart. Parents who lost children sometimes withdrew, leaving others to carry on the daily work. The cycle of grief and resentment hung over every winter. Think about how foreign this is compared to modern life. Today, if you feel tension at home, you step outside, go for a walk, or retreat to your own room. If your house feels crowded, you have doors, walls, and separate spaces. In a medieval winter, there was nowhere to go. You lived in the same room, ate the same meals, slept on the same straw, and breathed the same smoke as everyone else, day after day, week after week. There was no relief. The tension became part of survival. And yet, people adapted. They told stories by the fire, sang songs, and played simple games with dice or carved tokens to pass the time. They leaned on faith, praying together, hoping that God would bring spring quickly. But even those moments of closeness carried strain. The stories were repeated endlessly. The songs became monotonous. Faith wavered in the face of empty stomachs. Togetherness, while comforting in theory, often became suffocating in practice. So when you picture a medieval winter night, erase the image of cozy family harmony. Replace it with the reality, 20 bodies crammed into a smoky room, coughing, arguing, scratching lice, fighting over scraps, and glaring at each other as the fire burned low. That was family life in winter. Not peaceful. Not cozy. But crowded, tense, and exhausting. For a modern person used to privacy, to quiet, to space, the shock would be unbearable. You wouldn't just struggle with the cold or the hunger, you'd break under the constant pressure of living shoulder to shoulder with everyone else, with no escape, for months. And that's yet another reason you wouldn't last in a medieval winter. So far, we've talked about the physical hardships of a medieval winter, cold houses, bad food, sickness, and dangerous roads. But survival isn't just about the body. It's also about the mind. And in many ways, the mental and emotional toll of winter was just as devastating as hunger or disease. The long nights, the isolation, the endless monotony, these worked on the mind like a slow poison. And if you think you could tough it out, remember this, even the people who lived their whole lives in that world, hardened by experience, still broke under the weight of it. The first problem was darkness. In winter, nights stretched on for up to 16 hours. The sun rose late, barely climbing above the horizon before sinking again. Candles were precious, made of tallow that smoked and stank. Oil lamps were expensive. That meant most families lived by firelight, dim and flickering. Once the fire burned low, the house was swallowed in darkness. You couldn't read, even if you owned a book. You couldn't work on fine crafts without light. You couldn't even see the faces of the people next to you. For hour after hour, you sat in the dark, listening to the wind and the creak of the roof beams. That kind of darkness eats away at the mind. Today, we talk about seasonal depression, that winter blues, the effect of little sunlight on mood. Imagine that multiplied tenfold. There was no concept of vitamin D deficiency, no awareness of mental health. People just endured, sinking into gloom. Chroniclers described villagers sitting idle in the dark for weeks at a time. Some turned to prayer, whispering rosaries in the dark. Others told the same old stories again and again, trying to fill the silence. But boredom weighed heavy. With nothing to do, the mind turned inward, spiraling into despair. Then there was isolation. Travel was dangerous, markets slowed, and communication between villages nearly stopped. Families saw the same faces day after day, with no break, no fresh voices, no new ideas. In good times, that closeness might have brought comfort. In hard winters, it bred frustration and resentment. Neighbors gossiped, suspicions grew, and conflict simmered. Rumors of theft, witchcraft, or curses spread in the silence of long nights. When your world shrank to a single smoky room, imagination filled the gaps, and often, it wasn't kind. Religion offered some relief. The church calendar was filled with feast days, prayers, and rituals meant to carry people through the winter. Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas were celebrated, bringing moments of joy and community. Priests preached about endurance, faith, and the hope of spring. But faith was a double-edged sword. When people died, when famine struck, when illness spread, it was seen as divine punishment. The guilt of sin and the fear of God's wrath weighed heavily on minds already worn down by hunger. Instead of comfort, religion sometimes deepened despair. Dreams and superstitions also flourished in the long dark. People believed winter was a time when spirits walked more freely, when demons prowled in the night, when witches cast spells. Strange noises outside were blamed on ghosts. Illness was explained as curses. Folklore carried terrifying tales of winter creatures, the wild hunt sweeping across the sky, spirits that stole children, or demons that haunted barns. These weren't just stories for fun. In the silence of a dark, cold night, with wolves howling in the distance and your stomach empty, those stories felt real. Fear of the supernatural piled on top of the real dangers, adding another layer of mental strain. Children felt the weight too. Without sunlight, without play outdoors, they grew restless and noisy. Parents, already irritable from hunger and exhaustion, snapped at them. Beatings were common, punishment harsh. Children cried, argued, and added to the tension. For many, winter was a time of fear, not just of cold or famine, but of their own parents' tempers. Loneliness also crept in, even in crowded houses. Being surrounded by people isn't the same as feeling connected to them. Hunger made people selfish. Illness made them distant. Grief made them withdrawn. Families grieving lost children or parents withdrew into silence, leaving others to feel the chill of emotional absence. The house might be full, but the mind still felt alone. Another crushing weight was hopelessness. Imagine reaching February, when supplies were almost gone, the snow was still thick, and the sun felt weak. You've been cold for months, hungry for months, sick for months. You know spring will come eventually, but right now it feels endless. Each day is a repeat of the last. Wake up shivering, eat a thin meal, do survival chores, sit by the fire, sleep restlessly, repeat. The monotony drains the will to fight. Some people simply gave up. They stopped tending fires, stopped eating, stopped moving. Their families described them as fading, not from illness, but from despair. Even celebrations were bittersweet. Christmas brought moments of joy, singing, dancing, feasting, but they were brief and often hollow. The feast might last a night, but hunger returned the next morning. The laughter might warm the heart for an hour, but the cold crept back in as soon as the fire burned low. Joy was fleeting, despair constant. This mental strain left scars. Survivors of harsh winters carried the memories for life. They told stories of the year when people starved, when neighbors froze, when families broke apart. These weren't just warnings, they were trauma passed down through generations. Children who grew up in such winters never forgot the fear, and it shaped how they lived as adults. The cycle of dread renewed itself each autumn, when families looked at their food stores and wondered if they would last. Even before the snow fell, the fear began gnawing at the mind. Now put yourself in that position. You're used to distractions, phones, TV, books, lights, friends, hobbies. If you feel low, you go outside, exercise, seek help. In a medieval winter, there was none of that. No lights, no escapes, no therapy. Just darkness, silence, hunger, and the same four walls. The mind would turn in on itself, and very quickly, it would break. This is one of the most underestimated reasons you wouldn't survive a medieval winter. It wasn't just the body that froze or starved, it was the spirit that withered. People endured, yes, but many didn't. And even those who did often emerged broken, carrying the weight of winter long after the snow melted. So when you imagine a medieval winter, don't just picture shivering bodies or empty bowls. Picture minds unraveling in the darkness. Picture despair whispering louder than the wind. Picture people losing hope, one long night at a time. That was the psychological weight of winter, and for most of us today, it would be unbearable. When we talk about who suffered most in a medieval winter, it's easy to focus on peasants in general, or on whole families struggling together. But the truth is that not everyone had the same chance of survival. Two groups were hit harder than anyone else, children and the elderly. These were the ones who stood at the edge of life's strength, the ones whose bodies weren't built to withstand months of cold, hunger, and illness. And if you woke up one morning in a medieval village in midwinter, these would be the faces you saw fading first. Let's begin with children. Medieval childhood was already fragile. Infant mortality was high year-round, with many babies not surviving their first year. But winter was especially cruel. Newborns born in November or December were at a terrifying disadvantage. They were small, weak, and entirely dependent on their mothers, who themselves were often malnourished. Imagine being born in a drafty cottage, laid on a straw mattress, wrapped in a thin linen cloth, and immediately exposed to the chill of the season. Even with a fire nearby, the cold seeped into tiny lungs. Fevers, coughs, and infections killed infants by the dozens in winter months. Older children faced different challenges. They were expected to work from a young age, fetching water, carrying wood, tending animals, helping with weaving or mending. But in winter, these tasks were dangerous. A child fetching water from a frozen stream could slip and fall through thin ice. A child gathering firewood might wander too far into the forest and get lost in a snowstorm. Many didn't return. Those who did return often came home with frostbitten fingers or toes, permanently scarred from a single misstep. Even when they stayed inside, children weren't safe. They shared the same smoky, crowded air as everyone else. Cold spread like wildfire, turning into fatal pneumonia. With weak immune systems and small bodies, they couldn't fight off illnesses the way adults sometimes could. Malnutrition hit them harder, stunting their growth, hollowing their cheeks, and leaving them too weak to resist disease. Parents sometimes had to make awful decisions about how to ration food. Do you give more to the older child who can work, or to the baby who cries at night? Every choice carried guilt, and every choice carried consequences. For children, winter also stole away joy. In warmer months, they could run in the fields, splash in rivers, chase animals, and play with other children. In winter, they were trapped indoors, restless and noisy. Parents, already irritable from hunger, snapped at them. Some children were beaten for crying too much or for misbehaving in cramped quarters. The tension fell hardest on them, and many grew up associating winter not with coziness, but with fear. Those who survived carried those scars for life. Now let's turn to the elderly. Old age in the Middle Ages wasn't what we imagine today. Few lived past 50, and those who did were often frail, bent, and tired. Winter was merciless to them. Their bodies couldn't generate enough heat. Their joints ached in the cold. Their lungs, already weakened by years of smoke and damp, struggled to breathe. They caught colds easily, and those colds became fatal quickly. An elderly person in January was often described as slipping away, not because of one single illness, but because the season itself simply wore them down. Food was another issue. In times of scarcity, families prioritized the young, the strong, the ones who could work in the fields when spring returned. The elderly were often given smaller rations, sometimes skipped altogether because they were no longer seen as contributors to survival. This wasn't always done cruelly, it was simply necessity. If you had 2 loaves of bread left, you gave them to the children, not to the grandfather who couldn't chop wood anymore. Many old people died quietly of hunger, understanding that their lives were less valuable to the survival of the group. The psychological toll on the elderly was immense too. Winter meant watching children die, grandchildren waste away, neighbors vanish. It meant remembering previous winters when others had been lost. Many felt helpless, unable to work, unable to contribute, just sitting by the fire coughing and waiting. Some withdrew into silence. Others clung to prayer. But in most cases, old age and winter were a fatal combination. And then there was the grief families endured. Every winter meant loss, and those losses were often children and elders. Parents buried infants in frozen ground. Children buried grandparents in shallow graves when the earth was too hard to dig. The rhythm of death became part of the season itself, as expected as the snow. And that grief didn't make survival easier, it made it harder, weighing down hearts already heavy with hunger. The contrast with today couldn't be sharper. Modern medicine means babies survive winters easily, with warm clothes, clean houses, and vaccinations. The elderly live decades longer, with heating, nursing care, and medicine to ease their ailments. In the medieval winter, neither group had any of that. Survival depended on luck, strong bodies, and constant work. Children and the elderly had none of those advantages, and so they died first, again and again. And if you found yourself in that world, you'd see it everywhere. Empty cradles. Grandparents missing from the fire circle. Parents weeping quietly in the dark. Whole families carrying grief into spring, even if they themselves survived. That was winter. Not just cold, not just hunger, but loss. Constant, unavoidable, heartbreaking loss. So when you imagine yourself in a medieval winter, don't picture yourself as a strong adult enduring hardship. Picture yourself as a child with frostbitten toes, crying for food. Picture yourself as an old man coughing in the smoke, shivering under a thin blanket. Because those were the people winter took first. And for them, survival was never more than a slim chance. Up to this point, everything about a medieval winter sounds grim: cold houses, empty stomachs, sickness, death. And for the most part, it was. But even in the darkest seasons, people found ways to lighten the burden, if only for a moment. The festivals and traditions of winter weren't just entertainment. They were survival strategies for the spirit. Feasts, songs, dances, and rituals gave people brief escapes from the monotony and despair. They didn't erase the cold, they didn't refill the granaries, but they reminded people that life still had joy, even in the bleakest months. And yet, even these moments of celebration carried their own shadows. Let's begin with Christmas, the centerpiece of the medieval winter calendar. By our standards, medieval Christmas was both familiar and strange. It was a religious holiday, first and foremost, marking the birth of Christ. Churches held special masses, and villagers gathered in the cold to hear sermons and sing hymns. Bells rang across snowy fields, and the sound reminded people that they weren't entirely alone. Inside homes, families lit candles, decorated with greenery like holly and ivy, and sometimes burned a great Yule log that could last for days. The log was more than firewood, it was a symbol of light and hope, a promise that the days would lengthen again. But Christmas wasn't only spiritual. It was also one of the few times when food was shared more freely. Lords sometimes hosted feasts for their tenants, offering bread, meat, and ale as gestures of generosity. For peasants, these were rare chances to eat until they felt full. Imagine gnawing on salted pork, drinking hot spiced ale, and laughing with neighbors in a smoky hall. For one night, hunger faded. For one night, despair lifted. Children ran about, music played, and stories filled the air. These were the moments that gave people strength to endure the weeks ahead. Yet even Christmas had its limits. The feast was short-lived. The extra meat was gone by morning, the ale casks emptied, the laughter replaced with silence. The joy was real, but it was fleeting. And for many, it carried a bitter aftertaste, the knowledge that tomorrow they would return to stale bread, smoky rooms, and gnawing hunger. For the poor, who depended on the charity of their lords, the generosity of the feast reminded them of their dependence as much as it gave them comfort. After Christmas came other festivals. Epiphany in early January celebrated the visit of the Magi. Candlemas in February marked the purification of Mary and the blessing of candles. These events brought people together, broke the monotony, and gave them rituals to focus on. Candles blessed at Candlemas were thought to ward off evil and storms, symbols of safety in the dark. Superstitions wrapped around these days, offering psychological anchors when reality was harsh. There were also secular traditions, like wassailing, singing and drinking to ensure a good apple harvest in the year ahead. In some regions, villagers went door to door, offering songs in exchange for food or drink. It was part caroling, part begging, but it created a sense of community. Even the poorest could join in the singing, even if they had nothing to give. For a moment, the whole village was united in laughter and noise. Winter was also the season of storytelling. With little work to do in the fields, long nights were filled with tales, legends of saints, folk stories of spirits and monsters, heroic sagas passed down through generations. Children listened wide-eyed, their imaginations painting vivid pictures in the flickering firelight. Adults, too, leaned into the stories, losing themselves in words when they couldn't escape their circumstances. Storytelling didn't fill bellies, but it filled hours, and in winter, passing the time was itself a survival tactic. Music and dancing appeared too. Simple instruments like fiddles, flutes, or drums were brought out at feasts or gatherings. People stamped their feet on frozen ground, clapped, and sang. The warmth of movement, the rhythm of sound, and the closeness of others created fleeting joy. These weren't grand celebrations with lavish decorations. They were small, raw bursts of life, reminders that even in the coldest months, people could still find warmth in each other's company. But even these escapes were shaped by hardship. Ale flowed at festivals, yes, but it was weak and limited. Food was shared, but it was rationed carefully. Too much celebration could mean disaster later if supplies ran out. Joy was always balanced against caution. And for families who had already lost children or elders, the laughter of festivals sometimes rang hollow. Celebrations reminded them not only of life, but of death, the empty places at the table, the voices missing from the songs. And then there were the darker sides of winter festivities. In some regions, festivals gave people license to invert social order temporarily. During the Feast of Fools, for example, lower-ranking clergy mocked their superiors, dressing in costumes and parodying church services. In villages, misrule days let peasants act out against lords, at least symbolically. But these brief rebellions were tightly controlled. They let off steam, but they also reminded people of the strict hierarchies that ruled their lives. The joy was real, but so was the reminder of who held power when the festival ended. Children looked forward to these moments, of course. The chance to eat, to play, To see neighbors gathered in cheer, it broke the endless monotony of hunger and cold. For them, festivals sparkled in memory, even when most of the winter blurred together into grey. Adults, meanwhile, carried more complicated feelings. They cherished the joy, but they also knew it wouldn't last. And that knowledge weighed heavy once the music stopped and the fire burned low. In some years, festivals were muted or cancelled altogether. During famines, when food was gone, even Christmas feasts were impossible. During outbreaks of plague or disease, gatherings were dangerous. Imagine the despair of facing a winter without even those brief escapes. The silence would feel endless. The isolation, unbearable. Those winters left deeper scars than most. And yet, the fact that festivals existed at all says something powerful about human resilience. Even in the harshest times, people found ways to carve out joy. They sang, they danced, they told stories, they prayed. They created traditions that carried them forward, reminding them that winter wasn't everything, that spring would come, that the world would brighten again. For a modern person, used to endless distractions, it's hard to grasp just how precious these brief escapes were. Today, if you're bored or sad, you can watch a movie, call a friend, or scroll through a feed of entertainment. In the Middle Ages, joy had to be created together, in the moment, with whatever scraps you had. And because it was rare, it was cherished. One night of laughter could echo for weeks in memory, giving people the strength to survive. So when you imagine a medieval winter, don't just see hunger and despair. See the flicker of firelight on a Yule log. Hear the sound of villagers singing in the snow. Picture children giggling with full mouths for once, parents smiling despite the cold, neighbors raising mugs of ale together. These weren't constant realities, they were brief, fragile escapes. But sometimes, a moment of joy was enough to carry someone through another long, dark night. We've walked through the medieval winter together, step by step, hardship by hardship. The cold, the hunger, the sickness, the endless work, the fear of famine, the crowded houses, the grief, and the fleeting joy of festivals. Now, as we reflect, it's worth asking honestly, could you, with all your modern comforts and expectations, survive even a single medieval winter? The answer, for almost everyone alive today, is simple. No. You wouldn't. And here's why. Start with the body. Our bodies are soft compared to theirs. We've grown up in heated houses, wearing insulated coats, eating balanced meals year-round. Even when we think we're roughing it, camping outdoors, walking in the snow, or skipping a meal, we're doing it with safety nets. We know warmth and food are waiting. A medieval winter had no such promise. Step into a peasant's shoes for even one night and you'd already be in trouble. Your lungs would sting from smoke. Your skin would itch from wool and lice. Your feet would freeze in leather shoes. By morning, you'd be aching, exhausted, and desperate for relief. Relief that didn't exist. Then there's the food. Think about your last meal. Maybe you had fruit, vegetables, meat, rice, bread, snacks. Maybe you had coffee, tea, or soda to drink. Now imagine sitting in a medieval winter. Stepping outside could mean frostbite, wolves, bandits, or simply getting lost in a storm. Even fetching water or wood was a risk. You'd hesitate. You'd stay indoors. But indoors was no safer, filled with sickness and smoke. There was no safe place. No relief. No escape. Children and the elderly remind us how unforgiving the season was. If you're young, imagine yourself small, weak, crying from hunger. If you're older, imagine your body frail, your joints aching, your lungs wheezing. Those were the people winter claimed first. And since most of us fall into one of those vulnerable categories at some stage in life, the odds were always against survival. Even festivals, the few bright sparks, would be a shock to modern people. Yes, there was music, feasting, and laughter. But only briefly. Only enough to remind you of what you didn't have. A single day of plenty surrounded by months of famine isn't comfort, it's torment. And when the fire burned low after the feast, you'd be back where you started. And then comes the hardest truth: people then didn't just endure winter once. They endured it every year, from childhood until death. For us, even one medieval winter would feel like the hardest challenge of our lives. For them, it was routine. That tells you everything you need to know about the gulf between our world and theirs. They were hardened by necessity. We are softened by comfort. Drop us into their reality, and we'd crumble. Of course, survival wasn't guaranteed even for them. Many die every winter, of hunger, of cold, of illness, of despair. Survival wasn't a triumph of strength or cleverness. It was luck. Luck that your harvest was good. Luck that your firewood lasted. Luck that disease passed you by. Luck that your family didn't fracture under the strain. Winter was a dice roll, and for countless medieval people, the roll came up short. So why wouldn't you survive a medieval winter? Because you'd be unprepared in every way, physically, mentally, emotionally. Your body would freeze. Your stomach would empty. Your lungs would choke on smoke. Your mind would break under the darkness. You'd be another statistic, another name whispered in spring when neighbors counted who was gone. And yet, as bleak as that sounds, there's something strangely humbling about it. The fact that people lived through these winters at all is a testament to human resilience. They found joy in songs, in stories, in festivals, even in the smallest comforts. They endured what would break most of us today. And in doing so, they left behind the world we live in now, a world where winter is an inconvenience, not a death sentence. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, wrapped in soft blankets, with food in your stomach and clean water at your side, take a moment to think about that. Think about the millions of winters people survived before you, the countless hardships they endured, the children and elders they lost, the grief they carried. And be grateful for the hum of your heater, for the glow of your lamp, for the comfort that to them would have felt like paradise. Because if you ever found yourself in their shoes, in their world, in their winters, you'd learn the truth quickly. You wouldn't survive. Not for long.